Mary Covington stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, on a Tuesday morning in April of 1882, and the first thing she did was look every man on the dusty Main Street directly in the eye until each one of them looked away first. She carried 2 leather bags, a coil of hemp rope looped over her shoulder like a necklace, and a letter folded carefully inside her coat pocket that had promised her a husband, a home, and a new life somewhere west of everything she had already survived. She was 24 years old, brown-haired and brown-eyed, with hands that were already calloused in ways that women from the eastern cities did not have calloused hands, and a jaw set in the particular way of a person who had already decided that whatever came next, she would handle it. The man who was supposed to meet her was not there. She stood on the boardwalk outside the stage station for a full 15 minutes, watching cowboys and ranchers and merchants move up and down the street, the smell of horse and dust and cattle thick in the warm spring air. Caldwell sat just north of the Cherokee Strip, a border town where the cattle drives from Texas came thundering up the Kishom Trail before the herds were loaded onto trains heading east. It was loud and raw and alive with the particular energy of a place that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Mary reread her letter standing right there in the sun. Bernard Ford, it said, owner of the Ford Ranch, 12 miles east of Caldwell. 240 acres of grassland and cattle operation. Good Christian man, looking for a capable wife who does not mind hard work. A neighbor named Elias Greer had written the advertisement on Bernard's behalf, or so the letter explained, and Mary had answered it from Cincinnati, where she had been working in a textile mill for 3 years since her mother passed and her father's farm in Ohio had been sold to cover debts. She folded the letter back into her pocket, picked up her bags, and walked into the stage station to ask about hiring a wagon east. The man behind the counter, a heavy-set fellow with a red face and a thick mustache, looked at her rope and her bags and the no-nonsense expression she wore and said, "You one of them mail-order brides." "I am going to the Ford Ranch," Mary said calmly. "Is there a wagon I can hire or do I need to walk?" The man's eyebrows went up and then he laughed, not unkindly. "Tom Hendricks runs a cart out that way most mornings. He's at the livery right now if you hurry." She hurried, and she caught Tom Hendricks just as he was finishing hitching his mule, and she climbed up onto the wagon bench before he had even fully agreed to take her. And Tom Hendricks, a wiry man of about 50 with kind eyes, decided that arguing with this particular woman was probably not worth his time. They rolled east out of Caldwell with the morning sun climbing behind them, through rolling grassland that was greening up with spring, the sky so enormous and blue it seemed almost aggressive. Mary watched it all with wide, careful eyes. She had never been this far west before. Everything about Ohio had been hemmed in by trees and fences and the careful arrangement of human settlement. This land felt like it was still deciding whether to accept people at all. "You know Bernard Ford?" she asked Tom after a while. Tom tilted his head in the equivocating way of a man who is trying to be honest without being unkind. "Know of him," he said. "Quiet man. Lost his wife 2 years back. Has a cattle operation, like he said. Works hard. His foreman, Dutch Calloway, runs most of the day-to-day. Is he a good man?" Tom thought about this longer than Mary would have liked. "He's a fair man," Tom finally said. "Don't know him well enough to say more than that." Mary nodded and watched the grassland roll by. The Ford Ranch appeared after about an hour's travel as a cluster of buildings set against a long, gentle rise of land. The main house, a 2-story clapboard structure that had been painted white at some point and was now fading to a dusty cream. There were 2 large barns, a bunkhouse, several smaller outbuildings, and a set of corrals where she could already see cattle moving. The whole place was surrounded by a low, wide sweep of open grassland that stretched to the horizon in every direction, and it had the feel of a place that was functional and working and not particularly concerned with appearances. Tom pulled the wagon up to the front of the house, and before he had come to a full stop, the front door opened, and a man came down the porch steps. Bernard Ford was 31 years old, tall and lean, with the particular kind of leanness that comes from years of outdoor work rather than deprivation, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and a jaw shadowed with several days of beard. He had blue-gray eyes the color of a sky before rain, and when he came down those steps, he moved with a careful, deliberate quality, like a man who measured each action before he took it. He wore a plain work shirt, dark trousers, and boots that had been walked through a great deal of mud, and he held his hat in his hands, which Mary noted as a kind gesture even if he looked deeply uncertain about everything else. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at her, and she looked at him, and there was a beat of silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, just honest. "Miss Covington," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected and steady. "Mr. Ford," she said, and climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help, which she could see faintly surprised him. He looked at the rope over her shoulder and then back at her face. "I'm sorry I wasn't in town to meet you," he said. "We had a fence break north of here yesterday, and he stopped. It's not an adequate excuse. I should have been there." "You were not," she agreed, but she said it without particular heat. "I found my way." Something in his face shifted almost imperceptibly, and she thought it might have been relief, though she could not have said why. Tom Hendricks tipped his hat, collected his coins from Bernard, and headed back west toward Caldwell. Mary stood in the yard of the Ford ranch with her 2 bags and her rope and the letter in her pocket, and looked around at the land and the buildings and the cattle moving in the corral, and then looked back at Bernard Ford. "You want to show me the place," she said. He put his hat back on his head. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I should." They walked the ranch together that morning, and Bernard Ford spoke about it the way a man speaks about something he cares for deeply, but is not entirely sure how to express. He told her about the cattle operation, the Longhorn herd he had built up over 6 years, the land he had homesteaded before buying out the adjacent claim. He told her about the water rights and the grass and the difficulties of the spring calving season. He introduced her to Dutch Calloway, the foreman, who was a big, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with a gray mustache and an expression of permanent skepticism about the world, and who looked at Mary with unconcealed curiosity and not much warmth. He introduced her to the 4 ranch hands who worked the property. A young man named Pete Darrow, who was 19 and eager and somewhat foolish. A quiet older hand named Samuel Briggs, who barely acknowledged her. A Mexican vaquero named Eduardo Reyes, who touched the brim of his hat with genuine courtesy. And a solidly built young man named Cole Watkins, who was 22, and who looked at the rope on Mary's shoulder with something that might have been amusement or might have been skepticism, and it was hard to tell the difference. "You rope?" Cole asked, because he was not the type to leave a question unasked. "Some," Mary said. Dutch Calloway made a sound that was not quite a laugh. That evening, Bernard Ford showed Mary the house, which had clearly been cleaned with some effort in the days before her arrival. The downstairs was a kitchen and a sitting room and a small office, and the upstairs had 3 bedrooms. He showed her the room that would be hers, which was small and plain with a window that faced east and a quilt on the bed that was old but clean, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands again and said, "I want you to know I won't make any demands of you that are not agreed upon between us. The arrangement in the letter was about partnership. That's what I mean to honor." Mary looked at the room and then at him. "I appreciate that," she said. "I'll tell you what I think as things develop." He nodded. He looked like a man who had prepared speeches that he was now discarding because they no longer fit the actual situation. "Are you hungry?" he finally said. "Starving," she said honestly. They ate supper together at the kitchen table, a meal that Bernard had cooked himself, which was a simple stew that was better than she had expected, and they talked with the careful, testing quality of 2 people who are trying to understand what the other one is actually made of. He asked her about Cincinnati and Ohio. She asked him about Kansas and the ranch. He told her his wife, whose name had been Clara, had died of a fever in the winter of 1880, and he said it plainly, without either excessive grief or false distance, just honest acknowledgement of loss. Mary told him about her mother and her father's farm and the mill, and he listened with the full attention of a man who was genuinely interested rather than merely polite. By the time the dishes were done, they had not resolved anything exactly, but the air between them had settled into something easier, and when they said good night at the top of the stairs, there was the faint, uncertain beginning of something that might, with time, become trust. The next morning, Mary Covington woke before dawn, dressed, and went outside. She was a woman who had grown up on a working farm, who had learned to ride before she learned to read, who had spent her childhood following her father and her uncles through every kind of animal work Ohio had to offer. After her father's debts had taken the farm and she had gone to Cincinnati, the mill had nearly ground her down to nothing. 3 years of standing at a loom in a building full of noise and bad air. And the only thing that had saved her, the only thing that had kept the light in her, was the memory of open sky and the physical confidence of a woman who knew how to do real things with her hands and body. She had brought the rope because it was hers, because she had carried it with her from Ohio, because it was one of the few things she had left from her life before the mill, and because roping was one of those skills that lives in the muscles and does not leave even after years of disuse. She walked down to the corrals in the gray pre-dawn light and leaned on the fence and watched the cattle, and after a while she climbed over the fence and moved among them with the calm, practiced ease of a person who has spent time around cattle and knows how to move so they do not panic. And by the time the sun came fully up, she had assessed every animal in the nearer corral with quiet, careful eyes, and knew more about the herd's condition than she had known the evening before. She did not hear Dutch Calloway coming up behind her because Dutch Calloway could move quietly when he wanted to, which she filed away as interesting information. "You're up early," he said, leaning on the fence on the other side. "I always am," she said. "What are you looking at?" "That roan heifer near the back has a bad leg, left front, she's favoring it." Dutch looked. He was quiet for a moment, and she suspected he had already seen this himself and was checking whether she actually knew what she was talking about. "Noticed that yesterday," he said finally. "She needs to be separated out and checked. Might be a wire cut under all that mud." "Might be," Dutch agreed, in the tone of a man who is not yet agreeing to anything beyond the factual statement. Mary climbed back over the fence, uncoiled her rope, built a loop with the easy, habitual movements of a woman who had done this 10,000 times, and looked back at the corral. Dutch watched her with the expression of a man who is preparing to be politely dismissive. "I'll take that heifer out now if you like," Mary said. Dutch Calloway's expression did not change. "Pete," he called toward the bunkhouse. "Get out here." Pete Darrow came out of the bunkhouse door at a near run, still buttoning his shirt, and when he saw Mary standing there with a rope in her hands he stopped, and his mouth fell open slightly before he caught himself. "Miss Covington here wants to take out that roan heifer," Dutch said, and his voice carried the particular neutrality of a man who is arranging a demonstration he expects to be instructive. Mary did not say anything. She looked at the corral, picked her spot, climbed back over the fence, and went after the heifer. What happened next would be talked about in the Ford Ranch bunkhouse for a long time afterward. The roan heifer was not a cooperative animal. She was about 800 pounds of frightened cow in a crowded corral, and she moved with the unpredictable energy of an animal in discomfort. Most wranglers would have taken several attempts. Mary Covington built her loop while she walked, let it swing once and a half over her head in the unhurried, economical style of a woman who has nothing to prove and therefore doesn't waste motion, and dropped it perfectly over the heifer's head on the first throw from about 20 feet, which was a distance that made Pete Darrow's jaw drop entirely. She held the rope with her body angled correctly, her weight set, and called back over her shoulder, "Someone want to come tie her legs while I hold this?" Dutch Calloway was over the fence in the next second, and whatever skepticism had lived in his face had shifted into something that was not quite respect yet, but was the thing that comes directly before respect. They got the heifer out and inspected the leg, and there was indeed a wire cut beneath the dried mud, not severe but needing attention, and Eduardo Reyes, who had appeared from somewhere and watched the whole roping with a wide, appreciative smile, cleaned and dressed the wound while Mary held the rope and kept the heifer still. When it was done and the heifer was in a separate small pen with clean water and fresh hay, Dutch Calloway stood with his thumbs in his belt and looked at Mary Covington for a long, measuring moment. "Where'd you learn to throw a loop like that?" he asked. "My father's farm," she said, coiling her rope back with the same easy habit. "We ran cattle in Ohio when I was growing up. My father couldn't afford many hands, so we all worked." "That throw was better than anything Pete's done in 6 months, Dutch said, and Pete Darrow, who had just arrived at the corral fence, made an indignant sound. Mary allowed herself a small, private smile and said nothing. Bernard Ford had watched the whole thing from the edge of the yard. He had come out of the house when the morning was still gray and pink at the edges, intending to check on the cattle before breakfast as he did every morning, and he had come around the corner of the barn in time to see Mary Covington moving through his corral in the early light, rope in hand, with the unhurried confidence of a person who belongs exactly where they are. He had stopped walking and simply watched. He had written the advertisement, or rather he had allowed Elias Greer to write it, because his sister in Wichita had convinced him over a long winter that a ranch needed a capable woman to run its household, and he needed a partner in his life, and because he had been lonely in the particular grinding way of a man who has lost someone and does not quite know how to rebuild. He had expected a woman who could keep a house and cook and perhaps tolerate the isolation. He had not expected this. He watched her catch the heifer on the first throw, and felt something move in his chest that he had no immediate name for. He walked over to where Dutch was standing after the heifer was dealt with, and Dutch turned to look at him with an expression that Bernard had never quite seen on Dutch's face before, something between admiration and the chagrin of a man who had underestimated someone and knows it. "She can work," Dutch said simply. "I can see that," Bernard said. Mary turned from coiling her rope and found them both watching her, and she looked at Bernard Ford in the morning light, and there was a directness in her gaze that he found simultaneously uncomfortable and very interesting. "That heifer will be fine in a few days," she said. "You should check your south fence line. I noticed from the road coming in that there's a section that looks loose. That's probably where the wire that cut her came from." Bernard looked at her for a beat and then said, "I'll ride it this morning." "I'd like to come," she said, "if that's all right." It was all right, and she did come, and they rode the south fence line together on a clear April morning, and he watched her ride and realized she rode the way she roped, with a natural, economical skill that was not about showing off but simply about doing the thing correctly. She sat a horse the way people who have been on horses since childhood sit horses, as though the animal is just an extension of their own movement. They found the loose section of fence about a mile south, 3 posts that had been heaved by the winter frost and were leaning at angles that would fail in the next good wind, and Mary climbed down without being asked and began pulling the wire taut while Bernard reset the posts, and they worked together in a comfortable silence that felt strangely like a silence they had been practicing for years. "Can I ask you something?" Bernard said, tamping dirt around a post. "You can ask," she said. "Why did you answer the advertisement?" She was quiet for a moment, wrapping wire around a post with practiced hands. "I needed to get out of the mill," she said. "That's the honest first answer. 3 years in that building had nearly killed something in me. The second answer is that I wanted land again. I grew up on land, and losing it was like losing a part of myself. The third answer is that the advertisement said capable wife who does not mind hard work, which seemed honest in a way that some of the others didn't. There were others. There were several advertisements." She looked at him sidelong, a glint of something that might have been humor in her brown eyes. "Yours seemed the most straightforward." He tamped the last post and brushed the dirt from his hands and looked at her. She looked back at him. The April wind moved through the grass around them, and the horses grazed quietly at the end of their reins. "I should tell you that I'm not an easy man to know," he said. "I've been told I'm too quiet and too serious, and I work too much." "Clara told you that." He was still for a moment, and she thought she had overstepped, but then he said, "Yes. She used to say I'd worked myself past the point of knowing how to simply be still." "Was she right?" "Probably," he said. Mary looked at the fence line, straight and solid again now that they had fixed it, and then at the grassland rolling away south toward the Cherokee Strip. "I don't mind working," she said. "I don't mind quiet either. But I won't be invisible, Mr. Ford. I should tell you that right at the beginning." "I wouldn't want you to be," he said quietly, and he meant it, and something in the plain honesty of his saying it made Mary Covington look at him a little more carefully than she had been looking at him before. They rode back to the ranch house in the mid-morning sun and arrived to find Dutch Calloway in the yard with all four hands gathered around him, and Dutch's expression had the concentrated intensity he wore when something needed deciding. "We've got 60 head that drifted northeast last night," Dutch said. "Wind shifted. Gate wasn't latched properly. Cole found the tracks an hour ago." Bernard dismounted and his face tightened. 60 head loose on open range could scatter fast, and the grass to the northeast was broken country with gullies and scrub brush, hard to work. "I'll take Pete and Cole and Eduardo and we'll start northeast," Dutch said. "Samuel can hold the home herd." "I'm coming," Bernard said. "So am I," Mary said, and Dutch looked at her, and this time he did not make the dismissive sound he would have made the day before. He just looked at Bernard. Bernard looked at Mary on her horse, rope over her shoulder, expression entirely businesslike, and said, "Can you keep up over rough ground?" "Can Pete?" she said. Pete Darrow made the indignant sound again, and Eduardo Reyes laughed outright, and even Dutch Calloway's mustache moved in a way that suggested a suppressed smile. They rode northeast into the broken country and spent the better part of that morning and early afternoon gathering the scattered cattle. The terrain was exactly as difficult as Dutch had predicted, gullies cutting the grassland in unexpected directions, clumps of brush that the cattle had pushed through and then milled around in confusion. It was the kind of work that required both patience and quick action depending on the moment, and Mary Covington was both patient and quick in exactly the right proportions. She worked the far right side of the spread, which was the most broken ground, the side Dutch had assigned to Cole Watkins without much confidence because Cole was competent but not brilliant on rough terrain. But Dutch had not yet reassigned it when Mary had moved to that flank instinctively, reading the ground and the cattle movement the way a good ranch hand reads them. Cole Watkins came up alongside her at one point when they had a group of about 15 head pushed together and moving roughly in the right direction, and he said, without quite managing to hide his surprise, "You're pretty good at this." "I know," Mary said, and she said it without arrogance, just fact, and Cole Watkins, who had been inclined toward dismissiveness, found himself oddly unable to argue with her tone. The rope work came later, when a big longhorn steer decided that the gathered herd was not where he wanted to be and broke east at a full run. He was fast, and the ground between him and the nearest rider was cut by a gully that made pursuit nearly impossible. Pete was the nearest rider, and Pete's horse balked at the gully edge, and the steer was pulling away. Mary was 200 yards to the south, and she saw it. She read the steer's line, the angle of his run, the speed, and she urged her horse west at an angle rather than chasing, which was the instinct of a poor roper, and she cut around the upper end of the gully where the ground was solid, and she came up on the steer's left at a quartering angle with about 30 feet of distance, and she built her loop and threw it in the particular smooth fashion that she had been throwing since she was a child in Ohio. And the loop settled over the steer's neck, as clean as setting a hat on a post. The horse she was riding, a roan gelding she had borrowed from the ranch remuda that morning, hit the end of the rope like a trained cutting horse, which was lucky, and also due to the fact that she had positioned herself correctly before the throw so the stop would be clean rather than catastrophic, and the steer went to his haunches and came around and was caught. Pete Darrow arrived 30 seconds later, breathless, and stared. "How far was that throw?" he demanded. 30 feet, roughly, Mary said, keeping the rope tight. "I've never seen a woman." Pete started and then seemed to hear himself and stopped. "What?" Mary said pleasantly. Pete Darrow had the grace to look embarrassed. "I've never seen anyone throw that far clean," he finished, and he at least had the decency to mean it. They got the steer back with the rest and pushed the full 60 head south toward home, and by the time they rode into the yard it was getting on toward noon, the sun high and warm, and everyone was dusty and tired, and the cattle were back where they belonged. Dutch Calloway climbed down from his horse and looked at Bernard Ford, and Bernard Ford was looking at Mary Covington, and Dutch said, in the particular manner of a man stating something that has become obvious to everyone, "She's better than Cole and Pete put together on a rope." Bernard said, still looking at Mary, "I know." Mary was already dismounting and unsaddling her horse with quick, efficient movements, and when she heard this exchange, she looked up at both of them over the horse's back and waited to see what came next. Bernard Ford walked over to where Dutch stood and spoke in a voice low enough that it was private but not so low that Mary couldn't hear it if she chose to, which she did. "I'm going to have her work with the hands starting tomorrow," Bernard said. "She knows cattle. She can rope. We need that skill on the ranch and she has it." Dutch looked at him for a moment and said, "Cole won't like it." "Cole can learn something from her or Cole can find other employment," Bernard said, and there was no particular heat in his voice, just the flat certainty of a decision made. Mary heard this and something in her chest opened, some carefully held tension releasing, because she had not been entirely sure how this was going to go. She had come here as a mail-order bride, which was a category that most people put in a box marked domestic, and the ranch work had been something she had done this morning out of instinct and necessity rather than any explicit permission. And the fact that Bernard Ford, having watched her for approximately 18 hours, was reorganizing his understanding of what she was and what she could do, without being asked, and without making a production of it, was not something she had fully expected. She finished unsaddling and led the roan back to the corral, and told herself firmly that this feeling in her chest was simply relief and not anything else, and she was not particularly convincing to herself. At noon that day, Bernard walked into the bunkhouse where Dutch and the hands were cleaning up before the midday meal and said, simply, "Mary's going to work with the cattle operation starting tomorrow. Dutch, you assign her work the same as any other hand. She's capable of it and we need the help." Cole Watkins, who had been pulling off his boots, looked up. "She's supposed to be running the house," he said, not quite insubordinately but close. "She's going to do what she's good at," Bernard said, "and she's good at cattle." "A woman working cattle," Cole said flatly. Bernard looked at him with the blue-gray eyes that were level and completely calm. "She roped that steer this morning from a distance you couldn't have made clean," he said. "I watched you try to close the angle before she got there. She made a better call than you did. If you want to argue that she shouldn't be doing the work she's clearly better at than you, I'd like to hear the logic." Cole Watkins was 22 and had a stubborn streak, but he was not, underneath it, an unintelligent man, and he had no answer for this because there was no answer for it. He looked at his boots. Eduardo Reyes, who had been listening from the corner, said quietly, "She throws better than me, and I have been roping since I was 8 years old." He said this with an honest admiration that carried no resentment, and Cole Watkins looked at Eduardo and something in his face shifted. Pete Darrow said, "She really did throw that steer from 30 feet, and he said it with the enthusiasm of youth and no political awareness whatsoever. Dutch Calloway, who had been leaning in the doorway, said, "Work starts at dawn tomorrow. Anyone who has a problem with the arrangement can take it up with me." And that was the end of that particular conversation. The first week at the Ford Ranch passed in a way that was nothing like what Mary had imagined when she had read the advertisement in Cincinnati. She worked cattle through the mornings with the hands and handled the house through the afternoons and evenings, and she did both with the focused, capable energy of a woman who has been underused, and is now finally doing the full measure of what she is capable of. The work was satisfying in a bone-deep way that the mill had never been, and the land around the ranch was coming alive with spring in a way that made her heart squeeze with something very close to joy. Bernard Ford watched her and said little and did much. He adjusted the work schedule so the heaviest house chores fell on rainy or cold days when field work was difficult, which Mary noticed and appreciated. He made sure there was a good horse in the remuda that suited her, a gray mare named June who was quick and responsive, and she found June saddled and waiting for her each morning without being asked, which was the doing of Eduardo Reyes, who had appointed himself her unofficial ally in the week's first days. She and Bernard ate supper together most evenings, and the conversation between them deepened gradually, the way a river deepens as it moves from its source, gaining substance and current. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, about coming to Kansas at 22 with very little and building what he had piece by piece. She told him about her uncle's stories of the open range, and how they had been the one thing that kept her going through the mill years, the idea of a place where the sky was big enough to breathe in. He told her that he missed music, that Clara had played the fiddle and the house had been full of it, and now it was very quiet. She told him that she could not play a note of anything, but she had a good voice, and he looked surprised and pleased, and she felt self-conscious and changed the subject. Cole Watkins was the only ongoing difficulty. He was not a bad man, Cole Watkins. He was a young man who had grown up in a world with very fixed ideas about what men did and what women did, and Mary Covington was a direct assault on those ideas simply by existing and being good at things he was supposed to be good at. He was not hostile exactly, but he had a way of going quiet and tight-jawed when she demonstrated competence, and twice in the second week, he made comments that were not quite aimed at her but were clearly about her, remarks to Pete about how the whole situation was irregular and how things had worked differently before she came. Eduardo heard both remarks and said nothing, but his expression was eloquent. Dutch heard the second one and gave Cole a look that could have stripped paint. Mary was aware of all of this and chose her moment carefully. It came on a Friday of the second week, when a young bull got into the wrong pen and needed to be cut out and returned without injuring either the bull or the pregnant cows he had gotten in with. It was the kind of work that required precision and patience and very good roping, and Dutch assigned it to Cole because it was exactly the kind of job Cole was most suited for. Cole went in and spent 20 frustrating minutes chasing the bull around the pen while the cows grew increasingly agitated, and the bull was smart and fast, and Cole was getting red-faced and angry, which was making everything worse. Mary was watching from the fence. Dutch looked at her from the other end of the fence, and there was a question in his look, not an order, a question, which was a measure of how much his regard had shifted. Mary climbed over the fence and walked to where Cole was standing, out of breath, rope coiled but useless, and said quietly, "Let me try something." Cole looked at her and his jaw tightened. "You need a second angle," she said. "He keeps cutting back left because you're coming at him right. If you stay on his right and keep him thinking that way, I can come from the left and he'll be so focused on you he won't see me until I'm on him." Cole was quiet for a moment. "You're saying we do it together," he said. "I'm saying we do it together," she agreed. He looked at her for another beat, and she could see him deciding something, and then he said, "All right." And it was the first time he had agreed to anything she had proposed without resistance. They worked the bull together, Cole pressing from the right as she had outlined, Mary coming in from the left with quiet, patient feet, and when she threw her loop it was one of her cleanest throws, the kind that made Eduardo Reyes, watching from the fence, exhale a long, appreciative breath. The loop settled over the bull's neck and she had him, and Cole was there immediately to help work him toward the gate, and it was done in under 3 minutes. Cole Watkins stood on the other side of the gate after they closed it and looked at Mary for a long moment. "Where did you actually learn to rope?" he said, and this time the question was not skeptical. It was genuine. "My father," she said. "He could rope anything that moved. He used to say that the rope was just a way of asking an animal politely to go where you needed." Cole laughed, and it was the first time Cole Watkins had laughed anywhere near her, and it sounded genuine and easy. "That's a good way to put it," he said. That was the turning point with Cole Watkins, and from that Friday onward there was no more tightness in his jaw when she worked and no more quiet comments to Pete about irregularity. By the end of the second week, Mary Covington was simply one of the working members of the Ford Ranch cattle operation, and the unusual nature of this had been absorbed and accepted and was beginning to feel normal. What was not normal, and what she was increasingly aware of, was the quality of her attention to Bernard Ford. She had not come here looking to fall in love. She had come here looking for land and work and a life, and the arrangement was supposed to be a practical partnership, a marriage of necessity rather than feeling, and she was a sensible woman who understood that. But Bernard Ford kept doing things that made the sensible arrangement feel inadequate for what was actually happening between them. He left wildflowers on the kitchen table one morning with no explanation, a small bunch of prairie flowers that he must have gathered on his early morning ride, and when she asked him about them at supper he just said, "They were there on the fence line and seemed like a waste to leave," and looked at his plate in a way that told her he had not left them there by accident at all, and that he knew she knew that. He remembered things. He remembered that she had mentioned once that she found the Kansas wind beautiful if she was moving in it, and relentless if she was sitting still. And so when they had paperwork days, days of accounts and correspondence that had to happen inside the office, he always made sure the office window was open, and the work was done with the breeze moving through the room. He remembered that she had said her mother used to make a particular kind of cornbread on Sunday mornings, and 2 Sundays into her arrival, he came downstairs to find him in the kitchen with flour on his hands and a pan in the oven, and when she raised her eyebrows at him he said, "I asked my sister by letter, and she wrote me the recipe. I don't know if it's what you're thinking of, but it seemed worth trying." She had to look away for a moment because her throat had tightened unexpectedly. He was also, she was coming to understand, a man carrying a quiet grief that he had packed down very thoroughly and was not entirely sure how to unpack. There were moments in the evenings when she would look up and find him very still, looking at nothing in particular, and she recognized that particular stillness as the stillness of a person visiting a memory. She did not press him on these moments. She simply sat with him in the stillness, and after a while the stillness would pass and he would come back to the room and look at her, and sometimes he would say something and sometimes he wouldn't. But he always looked, and she always looked back, and those looks had started containing something that neither of them had named yet. It was Eduardo Reyes who named it in his indirect and dignified way one morning when Mary was riding back toward the barn and Eduardo was coming out. He touched the brim of his hat and said, "Senor Ford is a different man since you arrived." Mary looked at him. "Different how?" Eduardo considered. "He was a man going through motions," he said. "Working because he had always worked, eating because one must eat, sleeping because one must sleep. Now he is a man paying attention." He looked at her with dark, intelligent eyes. "He pays attention to you," he said. "With the full attention, it is very good." Mary was quiet for a moment. "He is a good man," she said carefully. Eduardo smiled, a slow, warm smile. "Yes," he said, "he is, and you know this already." She rode into the barn and unsaddled June and stood for a while with her hand on the mare's neck, and she acknowledged to herself, finally and honestly, that she had noticed everything Bernard Ford had done, and that she was not looking at it as the actions of a practical partner. She was looking at it the way a woman looks at a man when she is falling in love with him, which was an alarming and also entirely wonderful realization to have in a barn in Kansas in the spring of 1882. The question was what to do with it, which for Mary Covington always meant, be direct. She chose a Sunday evening after supper when the dishes were done, and they were sitting in the front room as they often did. him reading from a battered copy of a history of the Western Territories and her mending a piece of tack that needed stitching. The spring evening outside was soft and full of cricket sound, and the lamp on the table between them made the room warm and yellow-lit. She set down the tack. "Bernard," she said. He looked up. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I would like you to answer honestly even if you think the honest answer might be awkward." He put down his book. "All right," he said. "Are you finding me to be what you expected when you advertised?" He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "Better or worse." Something moved in his face, something complicated and honest and a little raw. "So far beyond better that the comparison seems absurd," he said. Mary looked at him and kept her voice very level, which took more effort than she let show. "I want you to know that I feel the same about this situation," she said. "Which is to say, it's becoming something I didn't anticipate, and I'm not sorry about it." Bernard Ford was quiet for a long moment. "What is it becoming?" he asked, and his voice was very careful, like a man reaching for something he is afraid to drop. "I think you know," she said. "And I think you feel it too, and I think you're being careful with it because you've lost someone and you're afraid of the feeling and what it might mean." He looked at the lamp for a moment. "Clara was the only person I had ever—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't expect to feel this again. I wasn't trying to." "Neither was I," she said, "but here it is." He looked at her then with those blue-gray eyes in the lamplight, and she thought she had never seen a man look quite so much like a person deciding something enormous. "I'd like to court you properly," he said. "If that's what you want, I'd like to start over in a manner of speaking, not the arrangement in the letter. Something that we're choosing for ourselves." Mary felt the warmth of this settle into her chest like the first good fire of winter. "I'd like that," she said. He nodded slowly, and then he almost smiled, and it was the fullest almost smile she had seen from him, and she decided she very much wanted to see the full version of it. That night she went to sleep in the small room with the east-facing window and listened to the Kansas night and felt, for the first time since her mother had died and her father's farm had gone to debt, and she had gone into the mill, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The courtship that followed was a genuine one, conducted in the context of daily ranch life, because neither of them was the type to separate living and loving into different compartments. They rode the range together in the mornings and checked the cattle and fixed fences, and in those long hours of practical work they talked about everything: their views on justice and fairness, on how land should be worked and how people should be treated, on faith and loss, and what they hoped the next decade of their lives would look like. She learned that he had strong opinions about the treatment of the Comanche and other tribes who had been driven from the lands his ranch occupied, that he spoke of it with a quiet anger that she respected even when the conversation was difficult. He had seen things during the earlier years on the plains that had marked him, he said. Injustices carried out in the name of progress that were not progress at all, just taking. And he tried to run his ranch with an eye toward fairness, even though he was aware that his very presence on this land was complicated history. Mary found this awareness, the willingness to look at difficult truths and not flinch, one of the most attractive things about him. She taught him things too. She had a knowledge of medicinal plants that her Ohio grandmother had passed on, and she went through the ranch pastures and showed him what grew there that could help with wounds and fevers and infections. She had a way with the more difficult horses in the remuda that Dutch watched with unconcealed admiration, a patient, consistent approach that gentled animals that had been edgy and half-broke into willing, reliable workers. Dutch Calloway, somewhere in the third week of Mary's residence, began bringing her problems that he would previously have brought only to Bernard, not because Bernard had told him to, but because he had independently concluded that Mary's judgment was worth seeking. This was the highest tribute Dutch Calloway was capable of giving, and everyone on the ranch recognized it as such. Cole Watkins asked her one afternoon if she would teach him to throw a rope the way she threw one, And she said yes, and they spent an hour at the corral with him learning to let the loop build properly rather than forcing it, which was the error most wranglers made. And Cole was a good student once his pride was out of the way. And by the end of the hour, he was throwing 10 feet farther than he had been, and he shook her hand and called her Mary for the first time rather than Miss Covington. And that felt like its own kind of milestone. April moved into May, and the days grew warmer and the grass grew tall, and the cattle were fat and healthy, and the ranch hummed with the particular productive energy of a well-run operation in good conditions. Bernard took her to Caldwell on the first Saturday of May to file some cattle records at the county office, and it was the first time she had been back to town since arriving. The main street had not changed, loud and dusty and full of cattle trade activity, but walking down it with Bernard Ford beside her, his hand at her back in the careful, courteous manner he had adopted since their conversation in the front room, felt entirely different from arriving there alone 3 weeks before with her bags and her rope and her letter. They stopped into the mercantile for ranch supplies, and the proprietor, a round man named Aldous Webb, looked at them and then at Mary and said, in the slightly too loud manner of a man who considers himself an entertainer, "This the May-lorder bride, Bernard. She looks like she could work harder than half your hands." Mary looked at Aldous Webb with the expression she had developed for exactly this kind of remark, pleasant and direct, and absolutely unwilling to be embarrassed by the truth. "I can work harder than at least 3 of them," she said, and Aldous Webb laughed and the moment passed, and Bernard's hand pressed very slightly more firmly at her back, and she thought that might have been because he was trying not to laugh himself. On the ride back to the ranch that afternoon, the supply wagon loaded and the sun getting long and gold in the west, Bernard said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "What for?" "For the advertisement," he said. "Elias Greer wrote it for me and I let him, and it described what I thought I needed rather than anything about me as a person or what I could offer. It was a poor way to begin." "You wrote me a letter afterward," she said. "That was you, not Elias Greer. I could tell the difference." He looked at the road ahead, the horses moving steadily in the gold afternoon. "What could you tell from it?" "That you were honest," she said, "and that you were lonely in a way you didn't fully intend to show but showed anyway. And that you were someone who took things seriously." He was quiet for a moment. "Were those good things to tell?" "They were real things," she said. "Real things are always better than good things." He turned and looked at her directly, and his face in the afternoon sun was open and unguarded in a way she had been watching him slowly allow himself to be, and she thought that this was what he looked like when he was happy, not the subdued or careful versions but the actual thing, and it made her want to reach over and take his hand, so she did. His hand closed around hers on the wagon seat between them, warm and firm, and they rode the rest of the way back to the ranch in the long golden light without speaking, and it was the best kind of silence Mary had ever sat in. May brought a cattle drive preparation, as Bernard had 40 head ready to drive up to the railhead at Caldwell for shipping east, and the week of preparation involved all hands working long, full days sorting and health checking, and making the practical arrangements for the drive. Mary worked every one of those days alongside the hands and Bernard, and she took the point position on one of the sorting mornings and ran it clean and fast enough that Dutch told Bernard afterward, in a tone of simple professional respect, that she was the best natural cattle hand he had worked with in 15 years, and he had worked with a great many. The drive itself was 2 days, an easy distance compared to the long Texas drives, and Mary rode it from start to finish. And when they reached the railhead and the cattle were penned for loading, she felt the satisfaction of it in her whole body, the satisfying weight of work genuinely completed. Standing at the railhead pens in Caldwell while the cattle moved through the loading chutes, Bernard came to stand beside her and they watched together. "I want to offer you something," he said, and his voice had the careful quality of a man who has been thinking about this for a while. She waited. "I want to make you a formal partner in the ranch," he said. not in the way the advertisement described. A real partnership. The ranch would be half yours legally. The work you're doing, you should own what you help build. She turned to look at him, and he was looking straight ahead at the cattle, his jaw set with the self-conscious look of a man who has said something important and is now waiting. "Bernard," she said. He looked at her. "Is this because you feel guilty about the advertisement or because you mean it?" "Because I mean it," he said. "You have made this ranch better in 5 weeks than I have managed to make it in 6 years. And because," he stopped, and the self-conscious quality in his face deepened into something more honest and more vulnerable. "Because I intend to ask you to marry me properly, not the arrangement in the letter but an actual proposal, and I want it to be an equal thing, if you'll have me." Mary Covington stood at the Caldwell railhead in the May morning sun, with cattle moving through the chutes and the smell of the trail on both of them, and looked at Bernard Ford, who was 31 years old and honest and quiet and careful, and had left her wildflowers on the kitchen table, and learned to make cornbread from a recipe his sister sent by letter. And she thought that she had left Cincinnati with the smallest possible hope that something real might be at the end of this journey, and that what she had actually found was so far beyond what she had hoped that the hope seemed, in retrospect, like a very timid thing. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." He looked at her for a moment in the way of a man who has been braced for various answers and is readjusting to this one. And then he smiled, the full version that she had been wanting to see since the almost smile in the front room, and it was worth waiting for. He kissed her there at the railhead, straightforward and warm, and several cowboys loading cattle nearby had the good manners to look away, except for Pete Darrow, who let out a whoop of enthusiasm that made his horse startle and made everyone else laugh. They married 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in late May, in the small church in Caldwell that served the ranching community east of town. The ceremony was conducted by a circuit preacher named Reverend Holt, who came through Caldwell every 3rd week, and it was attended by all the Ford ranch hands and by Bernard's sister Margaret, who came from Wichita with her husband for the occasion, and by Tom Hendricks, who had driven Mary in from the stage that first morning, and who seemed to feel this gave him a proprietary interest in how things had turned out. Mary wore a dress of blue cotton that she had made herself in the weeks before the wedding, staying up late in the kitchen with a lamp and the sewing, and it was simple and well made, and she wore it with the same unapologetic practicality with which she wore everything, without frills or performance, just herself in a good dress. Bernard wore his best suit, which was plain dark wool, and he looked at her when she came down the aisle with an expression that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, open and certain and tender, in a way that his normally careful face had never quite been before. Reverend Holt read the service, and they said their vows to each other with steady voices, and when he pronounced them, married, Bernard kissed her again, and this time Pete Darrow whooped again, and nobody told him not to. Margaret Ford, who was 34 and sharp and warm in equal measure, took Mary's hands after the ceremony and said, "He has not looked like this since before Clara died. You've given that back to him." She said it simply, without manipulation or pressure, just truth, and Mary found that she liked Margaret very much. Dutch Calloway, at the small celebration in the ranch yard afterward, came and shook Mary's hand with both of his, which was the most demonstrative gesture anyone had ever seen Dutch Calloway make. The summer that followed was the best of Bernard Ford's adult life, and he knew it while it was happening, which was a rarer kind of happiness than the kind you only recognize afterward. The ranch prospered. The cattle were in good condition, the grass was good, the calving numbers were strong. Dutch ran the day-to-day operation with his usual competent authority, but now he had Mary as a genuine partner in the decision-making, and the combination of Dutch's experience and Mary's instinct and ability produced a cattle operation that was running at a higher level than it ever had. They added 20 acres of hay production, Mary's suggestion, to reduce their dependence on winter forage costs. She identified 2 calves born early in the summer with a structural leg problem that would have developed into something serious and costly if left unaddressed, and a proper treatment regimen fixed both animals before the problem became irreversible. Eduardo Reyes, in his quiet way, became one of Mary's closest friends on the ranch, a friendship of mutual respect between 2 people who took their work seriously and understood each other's approach to it. He taught her the particular roping techniques of the Mexican vaquero tradition, the intricate loop work that he had learned from his father and grandfather, and she brought to his instruction the same focused attention she brought to everything. And by the end of the summer, she could throw forms she had never known before. She returned the favor by teaching him the fence repair and post-setting techniques she had learned from her father, precise, labor-saving methods that Eduardo had never been shown, and which he took to with the enthusiasm of a craftsman learning a better tool. Pete Darrow, who had started as the youngest and most foolish hand, had grown up considerably under the combined influence of Dutch's direct authority and Mary's more patient, explanatory approach, and by midsummer, he was doing the work of a competent, reliable ranch hand, rather than an enthusiastic boy making expensive mistakes. Cole Watkins had become, quietly and without fanfare, one of Mary's genuine advocates, and when strangers came to the ranch and expressed surprise at her role in the cattle operation, it was Cole who explained it with the matter-of-fact confidence of a man who had worked alongside her and needed no one else's opinion on the matter. In August, Elias Greer came to the ranch to discuss a shared fence line dispute that needed resolving. Elias was the neighbor who had written Bernard's advertisement, a middle-aged man with a prosperous ranch and an air of comfortable authority about him, and he came expecting to deal with Bernard and was visibly uncertain when he found Mary sitting at the ranch office table with the relevant land survey papers already spread out. He looked at Bernard, who was also at the table. "I expected this to be a conversation between ranchers," Elias said carefully. "It is," Bernard said. Elias looked at Mary again. "I've reviewed the survey," Mary said evenly. "The dispute is about the northeast corner post. According to the 1878 survey, the line runs 2 feet east of where your fence is currently placed. That puts approximately 3 acres in question." Elias opened his mouth and then closed it. "I've prepared a proposal," she continued. "We reset the corner post to the correct survey point, which costs us both a day's labor and some materials. In exchange, we extend your water access rights to the north branch of the creek by 40 yards, which benefits you more than the 3 acres would. It's a fair trade that avoids a formal dispute filing and the legal costs that would involve." There was a silence. Elias Greer looked at the papers and then at Mary and then at Bernard, who was watching this with the expression of a man who has had a very good few months. "She's right about the survey," Elias said finally. "She usually is about things like this," Bernard said. Elias Greer left an hour later having agreed to every point of Mary's proposal and looking faintly shaken in the way of a man whose assumptions about the world have been gently but firmly revised. Bernard waited until Elias' horse was out of the yard and then said, "He wrote that advertisement for me because he thought I needed managing. I think he's regretting the introduction." Mary laughed, a full, genuine laugh, which Bernard collected like gold. Summer became fall, and fall was the second cattle drive of the year, 25 head to the railhead and a good price for them, and the ranch closed the year in better financial shape than Bernard had ever managed before. He told her the numbers one October evening at the kitchen table, going over the accounts together, and when he told her what the year had made versus what the previous year had made, the increase was significant enough that she had to look at the numbers twice. "That's a good year," she said. "That's the best year this ranch has had," he said, looking at her over the account book. "Because of you." "Because of both of us," she corrected, which he accepted. In the November of that first year, Mary came to breakfast one morning and sat across from Bernard at the kitchen table, and looked at him with an expression he had not seen from her before, something that was cautious and hopeful and slightly nervous all at once, which was unusual enough on Mary's generally direct face that he put down his coffee immediately. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. He waited. "We're going to have a child," she said. "In the spring, I think." Bernard Ford sat very still for a moment, and she watched his face move through several things quickly, surprise and then a kind of wonder and then something so unguarded and full that she felt her own throat tighten. "Mary," he said, and her name in his voice at that moment was a whole sentence on its own. "I know it's," she started. "It's wonderful," he said firmly, and reached across the table and took both her hands. "It's wonderful." She looked at him holding her hands in the gray November morning and felt the rightness of it settle into her chest like sunlight. The ranch hands took the news with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Pete Darrow was extravagantly happy on behalf of everyone. Eduardo Reyes smiled his slow, warm smile and said he would make a rattle from the materials his mother had taught him to use, a tradition from his home. Dutch Calloway said, "Good," in the particular tone that meant he was moved and did not intend to discuss it. Cole Watkins shook Bernard's hand and then, after a moment's hesitation, shook Mary's hand too, which felt like its own small ceremony. Margaret came from Wichita for a week in December and sat with Mary in the evenings by the fire and talked about practical things, the things a woman needed to know about pregnancy and childbirth on a ranch far from a doctor. And her advice was specific and useful, and she gave it without either frightening Mary or treating her as fragile, which was exactly the right approach for Mary Covington. Winter settled over the Ford Ranch with the particular white-tan-gray solitude of a Kansas winter, and Mary and Bernard moved through it together in the close, warm way of two people who have built something real and are learning to live inside it. The evenings by the fire were long and quiet and full of conversation and comfortable silence in roughly equal measure, and he read to her sometimes, the history books he favored and occasionally poetry, which he read with a slightly self-conscious air that she found entirely endearing. She sang sometimes, in the evenings when the wind was loud outside and the house was warm and closed, and his face when she sang had the particular expression of a man who has been given something he did not know he needed. She continued to work through the winter, adjusted for her condition, doing the indoor cattle management work and the account-keeping and the management of the bunkhouse provisioning that Dutch handled less well than she did, and riding out when the weather allowed, though with more care and at Bernard's quiet concern. She and Dutch had developed a genuine working partnership by this point, and their daily morning consultations over the work plan had become one of the functioning pillars of the ranch's operation. February was cold and hard, the cattle requiring supplemental feed and daily checking, and Mary worked alongside the hands through the worst of it, always within sensible limits and always aware of the growing weight of the child she was carrying, but not retreating into the house simply because she was carrying. Bernard walked the fine line of genuine concern and respect for her judgment with a care she appreciated enormously, never ordering her inside but always checking, always present, always making sure the conditions were right rather than simply assuming they would be. One bitter February night, a storm came in fast from the northwest, and the temperature dropped 30 degrees in 2 hours, and several cattle in the north pasture were at risk of being caught in the open. Bernard and Dutch and Cole rode out into the storm, and Mary, who was 7 months along and could not ride at that stage, worked the barn preparations with Eduardo and Pete, getting the stalls ready for whatever animals came back, making sure there was hot water and dry hay, and the tools for thawing and warming a cold-stressed animal. And when Bernard rode back an hour later, snow-covered and frostbitten at the ears. The barn was ready and organized, and every animal they brought in was turned into a prepared stall without delay, and he looked at the barn and at her, and came to her in the middle of it all and put both arms around her carefully and said into her hair, "You are the most capable person I have ever known. "You're freezing cold," she said against his coat. "Yes," he agreed, and did not let go. In the early morning of the 15th of March, 1883, in the bedroom of the Ford Ranch house, with the first faint color of spring dawn coming through the east-facing window of the room that had been Mary's when she first arrived, their son was born. He was large and loud and healthy, with a head full of dark hair, and even in his first minutes of life, an expression of determined alertness that made the midwife who had come from Caldwell laugh and say she had never seen a newborn that looked so purposeful. Bernard was there, which was not entirely the custom of the time but was entirely Bernard's way of doing things, and when Mary put their son in his arms, he held the baby with the careful, concentrated attention of a man who understands that he is holding something more important than anything he has ever held. "What should we call him?" Bernard asked. Mary had thought about this. "William," she said, "after my father." Bernard looked at her and at the baby. "William Ford," he said, and it settled like something that had always been true. William Ford grew that spring and summer in the way of healthy ranch babies, fattening up and growing loud and opinionated, and beginning to move in the purposeful way his first expression had promised. Mary nursed him and worked around him, and then, as he grew enough to be safely managed in the ranch yard, sometimes brought him out in the mornings in the large wooden carry cradle that Eduardo had made from good hardwood, with carved sides and a solid base, a beautiful piece of practical work. And William lay in it in the early morning sun and watched the activity of the ranch around him with the wide, serious eyes of a baby taking in information as fast as he can. The ranch in the spring and summer of 1883 ran as well as it ever had, and the reputation of the Ford operation had grown in the ranching community around Caldwell. Ranchers came from neighboring operations to talk cattle with Bernard, and they found Mary in most of these conversations, offering numbers and observations on herd management, and most of them adjusted quickly to her presence, and some of them came back specifically to talk with her, which Bernard found deeply satisfying and said so. There was a day in June of 1883 when a young rancher from a neighboring property named Davis came to ask about the hay production that Mary had initiated the previous year, having heard from Elias Greer that it was working well, and he sat at the kitchen table with Mary and Bernard while the baby slept in the next room, and Mary walked him through the specifics of the acreage and the yield and the winter cost savings, and Davis listened carefully and nodded and made notes. And when he left, he shook Mary's hand and said, "Mrs. Ford, you think about ranching the way I'd like to think about it," which was a high compliment from a man of his background, and she knew it. August of 1883 brought a different kind of event. A man came to the ranch one morning asking for work, which was not unusual in itself, as hands came and went with the seasons. But this man, who gave his name as Harlan Cross, had a way about him that Dutch Calloway identified in the first 30 seconds as belonging to the category of men who cause problems. He was big and rough and not unintelligent, and he looked at the ranch operation with calculating eyes, and at Mary with a contempt he made no effort to hide. Dutch told him there was no work available and he rode off, and Dutch mentioned it to Bernard at noon. Bernard listened and said, "Keep your eyes open." Mary had seen Harlan Cross from the kitchen window when he arrived, and had the same instinctive unease that Dutch had had, the reading of a person that comes from paying close attention to people. She told Bernard at supper that she thought they should send word to the neighbors to keep watch, that a man looking at a ranch that way was often looking for opportunities of the wrong kind. Bernard sent word. 3 weeks later, Harlan Cross and a man with him tried to move a group of Ford cattle from the north pasture at night, which was exactly the thing that Mary and Dutch had feared. But because word had been sent and the northern fence was being watched, Cole Watkins saw them and got to Bernard before they had moved the cattle far, and Bernard and Cole rode them down while Eduardo and Pete held the cattle, and a brief, Decisive confrontation in the dark left Harlan Cross and his partner escorted firmly off the range and pointed toward the marshal's office in Caldwell, which was where they went, and from there to wherever the marshal saw fit to send them. It was a small incident and resolved cleanly, but it was the kind of incident that reminded everyone that the world outside the ranch was not uniformly cooperative, and it reinforced the value of the attentive management of the place that Mary and Dutch and Bernard had built together. Cole Watkins, riding back from the northern pasture that night, said to Pete Darrow in a tone of comfortable certainty, "Mrs. Ford called that 3 weeks ago. She saw it in the man's face in 5 minutes." "She sees everything," Pete said with the admiring certainty of youth. "She does," Cole agreed. "I'm glad she's on our side." Fall of 1883 was another good cattle season, and William Ford, 7 months old and increasingly vocal about his opinions, came to the Caldwell railhead in Mary's arms for the fall drive completion, his first visit to town, and sat in the crook of his mother's arm and watched the cattle loading with the serious, wide-eyed attention that was becoming his characteristic expression. Bernard stood beside them and watched his wife watching the cattle and holding their son, and felt the particular fullness that belongs to a man who has more good in his life than he had believed was possible for him. He put his arm around her shoulder and she leaned into him just slightly in the comfortable way of people who have been leaning on each other long enough that it has become the natural angle of standing. "Good year," she said, watching the cattle. "Very good year," he said. "Next year we should add to the herd," she said. "The east pasture can support more head than we're running. We've been conservative." "I was thinking the same," he said. She turned and looked at him. "Were you?" He smiled. "You mentioned it 6 weeks ago and I've been thinking about it since. And you were going to tell me when." "I was going to tell you when I had worked out the numbers," he said, "and then discovered you had already worked out the numbers, which you did 2 weeks ago on the kitchen table while William was asleep, and which I found and did not mention." Mary laughed. "You found my notes. They were very good notes." She shook her head at him, still laughing, and William, who had been watching this exchange with his characteristic intensity, apparently decided that laughter was a good development, and produced a sound of enthusiastic approval that made the nearest cowboys turn to look, and then grin in the involuntary way of people encountering a baby being happy. The winter of 1883 and 1884 was hard but manageable, and the ranch came through it in good shape, and in the spring of 1884 Mary's second pregnancy became apparent, which she told Bernard one evening in March with the same careful, hopeful expression as the first time, and he responded with the same open happiness. And Pete Darrow, when told, whooped again, and Dutch Calloway said good again. And Eduardo Reyes went to his bunkhouse chest and began selecting materials for a second rattle. William, who was walking by this point in the experimental, determined manner of a 1-year-old, who has decided that walking is going to happen regardless of what the floor thinks about it, observed the increased activity around his mother with the philosophical acceptance of a child who has been raised in a working ranch where things were always happening. The years at the Ford Ranch settled into a rhythm that was full and demanding and deeply satisfying. The operation grew, carefully and sustainably, as Mary had proposed, expanding the herd in stages that the land could support, adding a second hay meadow, improving the winter facilities for the cattle so that the cold season losses, which had always been an accepted part of ranching, were brought down to near nothing through better preparation and management. Dutch Calloway retired from the foreman position in the fall of 1884, his knees having finally informed him that the horse work was no longer compatible with his age. He did not leave the ranch, which would have been unthinkable to everyone involved, but transitioned to a role that was something between ranch manager and advisor, living in a small cabin Bernard built him near the main house, and working the accounts and supply management and the practical running of the operation from his chair rather than his saddle. He and Mary worked together on these tasks with the comfortable efficiency of a long partnership. And Dutch, who had once been skeptical of Mary Covington's presence on this ranch for approximately 12 hours, was now her most committed professional advocate. Eduardo Reyes, who had been the first of the hands to welcome her genuinely, eventually married a woman named Rosa Alvarado who came from a Mexican ranching family south of Caldwell, and they built a small house on the eastern edge of the Ford Ranch property that Bernard deeded to them as a wedding gift, because Eduardo was the best vaquero Bernard had ever worked with, and Bernard was not interested in losing him. Rosa was quiet and skilled and became a friend to Mary, and her knowledge of the land, which was the kind of knowledge that has lived in a place for generations and is different from and complementary to the knowledge that comes from management and observation, deepened Mary's understanding of the range she worked. Cole Watkins moved on after several years, going north to Wyoming where land was still being opened up, and a capable cowhand could establish his own stake. But he left with genuine warmth, and he wrote occasional letters back to the ranch, which Mary answered, because she had become his first real teacher in the craft of cattle work, even if neither of them had framed it quite that way at the time. Pete Darrow, who had been 19 and foolish when Mary arrived, grew into a steady, reliable man and a good cowhand, and he stayed on at the Ford Ranch for years, becoming eventually the foreman when the new hands came on in the later years of the operation's expansion, which was a position he filled with a conscientious seriousness that no one who had known him at 19 would have predicted, but which felt, to those who had watched him grow, entirely inevitable. Mary and Bernard's second child, born in November of 1884, was a daughter, and they named her Clara, which was a decision they made together on a quiet evening, Bernard suggesting it carefully and Mary accepting it warmly, because honoring what he had loved was not a threat to what they had together. It was simply part of who Bernard Ford was, and she loved who Bernard Ford was. William Ford, older brother, adjusted to Clara with the focused intensity he applied to everything, examining his sister in the first days with the same wide, serious eyes he had directed at the cattle loading in Caldwell, as though taking inventory. Clara was louder than William had been as a baby, and more immediately communicative about her opinions, and the combination of the two children in the ranch house gave it a noise and life that made even the evenings by the fire different, fuller, more complicated, and more joyful. The years moved. The ranch grew. The land around Caldwell changed. The cattle drives from Texas that had defined the town through its early years gradually declining as the railroads pushed further south, and the long drives became unnecessary, and the ranching economy shifted from drive cattle to settled ranching, which was the direction Bernard and Mary had always been building toward. Their cattle operation was well positioned for this shift, deep-rooted and diversified, with the hay production and the improved winter facilities and the careful breeding decisions that Mary had championed over the years. In 1886, a drought year that tested every ranch in Kansas, the Ford operation came through in better condition than most of their neighbors because of the hay stores and the conservative stocking decisions that Mary had argued for 2 years before, when the good years had encouraged most ranchers to add as many head as their land would hold. She had disagreed with this pattern, seeing the risk of a bad year in the numbers the way a mathematician sees a fault in a calculation, and Bernard had trusted her reading and they had held the herd at sustainable numbers, and in the drought year they were grateful for it. Elias Greer, whose herd took serious losses in 1886 because he had overstocked, came to Bernard in the early spring of that year, hat in hand and pride set aside, and asked for advice. Bernard sent him to talk to Mary, which Elias did, and Mary spent an afternoon with him at the kitchen table going over his situation with the honest, practical specificity of someone who understands land and animals and numbers, and is not interested in making the man feel worse than he already does, only in finding the path forward. Elias Greer rode home that afternoon with a written plan of action and a look of a man who has been reminded that being willing to ask for help is its own kind of strength, and the following year his operation was recovering. He stopped in the yard before he left that afternoon and looked at Mary on the porch steps and said, "I wrote that advertisement thinking I was doing Bernard a favor by finding him a domestic wife." He shook his head, not unkindly, more at himself. "I had no idea." "I know," Mary said pleasantly. "He's a lucky man," Elias said. "We're both lucky," she said, and meant it. The children grew, and the ranch grew, and the years at the Ford Ranch accumulated into the particular dense, layered texture of a life that has been fully lived. William Ford at 5 was earnest and capable, and had already taken to following Eduardo around the property with a purposeful air that Eduardo, who had no children of his own yet at that point, found simultaneously touching and amusing. By 7, he was helping with small cattle tasks under close supervision, and by 9, he was riding well and showing the same instinct for the work that his mother had shown, which made Bernard watch him from a distance sometimes with a full, complex expression. Clara Ford was her own person entirely, which everyone on the ranch knew before she was 3 years old. She was loud and opinionated and physically fearless, and had her mother's jaw and her father's eyes, and she climbed everything and investigated everything, and had a particular way of stating her views that made Dutch Calloway, who had known 4-year-olds to be fundamentally uninteresting, concede that Clara Ford was an exception. Mary taught both children to rope as soon as they had hands strong enough to hold a loop, just as her father had taught her, and William took to it with steady, methodical practice, and Clara took to it the way a duck takes to water, instinctively and with great enthusiasm and occasional inaccuracy that improved rapidly. Bernard watched his daughter throw a loop in the corral one spring morning when she was 6 years old, a good clean throw that settled over the fence post they were using as a target, and he looked at Mary standing beside him and said, "She throws like you." "She has good hands," Mary said. "She has everything," Bernard said, and his voice was the voice of a man who knows exactly how much he has and is continuously grateful for it. The Ford Ranch in the early 1890s was one of the well-regarded cattle operations in Comanche County, known for the quality of its animals and the fairness of its dealings, and the somewhat unusual fact that the woman who ran half the operation could outwork and outrope most of the hands on it. This reputation had ceased to be remarkable to anyone who knew the ranch, but it retained its novelty to those encountering it for the first time, and Mary Covington Ford had developed a patient, good-humored relationship with the periodic surprise of strangers. She was 36 in 1894, 12 years after she had stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell with her bags and her rope and her letter, and she was the same woman who had done that, just more of herself than she had been then, more settled and more certain and more present in every room she occupied. Her hair had threads of gray in it now, and her hands were more callous than ever, and she was, if such a thing was possible, a better roper at 36 than she had been at 24, because the vaquero techniques Eduardo had taught her had added dimensions to her natural skill that the years of practice had integrated deeply. Bernard at 43 was the same deliberate, careful man she had known, but the grief that had lived quiet and packed down in him when she first arrived had been replaced, not erased but replaced, by something that was better and more alive. He smiled more easily now and laughed more, and had the ease of a man who has been loved well for a long time and knows it. His hair was more gray than brown, and the lines around his eyes were deep from years of squinting against the Kansas sun, and he was, in Mary's estimation, the most handsome he had ever been. They had a third child, a son named James Thomas Ford, born in 1889, who at 5 years old was the most physically adventurous of the 3 children and was Dutch Calloway's particular favorite, largely because James had an inexhaustible interest in everything Dutch knew about the practical management of a cattle operation, which Dutch found deeply flattering. One evening in October of 1894, Bernard and Mary sat on the front porch of the ranch house in the cooling fall air, watching the sun go down over the western grassland in the particular spectacular fashion that Kansas sunsets had, the sky going through gold and orange, and the particular deep rose that made even people who had seen 1,000 Kansas sunsets stop what they were doing to look. William was 14 and inside at the kitchen table doing the schoolwork that the local teacher assigned him, with the help of the books that Mary had ordered from a publisher in Kansas City over the years, because she had been determined that her children would have learning alongside the ranch skills. Clara was 11 and had been in the barn for the last hour doing something with the horses that Eduardo had described as teaching June's foal to be reasonable about having her feet handled, which was accurate. James was 5 and asleep inside, having fallen asleep at supper with his face nearly in his plate from the exhaustion of a day spent following Pete Darrow around the south pasture. Mary had a cup of tea and Bernard had coffee, and the sunset was doing everything it knew how to do, and the ranch yard was quiet in the particular settling way of an evening. "You ever miss Cincinnati?" Bernard said, not for the first time over the years, but with the genuine curiosity he still had about all the parts of her life he hadn't been there for. "Never," she said, with the same certainty she always said it with. "Not even a little. There is nothing there I miss," she said. "There is nothing I wish had been different, not even the mill, because the mill was what made me understand how much I needed this." She gestured, a small gesture that encompassed the yard and the land and the sky and the house behind them with all of its noise and life. "How much I needed all of it." Bernard looked at her in the sunset light. "I need to tell you something," he said, in the tone of a man who has been carrying a thought and has decided to put it down. She looked at him. "When you stepped down from Tom Hendrick's wagon that first morning," he said, "I was terrified. I had spent 3 months telling myself that this was a practical arrangement, and that was enough, and practical arrangements were fine. And then you came down from that wagon with your rope over your shoulder, and you looked at the ranch, and then you looked at me like you were figuring out whether I was worth your time. And I knew in about 30 seconds that the practical arrangement was not going to be sufficient for what was actually happening." Mary was quiet for a moment. "You knew that on the first morning. I suspected it. I was certain by the time you threw that heifer." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That's when you knew you were in love with me, when I roped a cow." "That's when I knew I was in serious trouble," he corrected. "I was already before the heifer, when you looked at me in the yard and told me you'd found your own way into town because I wasn't there to meet you. I was trying to be reasonable about it," she said. "I know. That's what got me." He looked at the sunset, smiling the full smile that she had been collecting for 12 years. "The completely reasonable way you refused to let me off the hook." Mary laughed, a full, warm sound that moved out into the evening air. She reached over and took his hand on the arm of his chair, and he turned it and held hers. The sun went the rest of the way down, the sky deepening from rose to purple to the first clear dark blue of a fall evening, and the stars began to appear over the Ford Ranch, and the crickets started up in the grass, and the horses moved quietly in the corral, and inside the house William bent over his books and Clara came in from the barn with the purposeful energy that was her constant manner, and somewhere upstairs James Thomas Ford slept the profound, restoring sleep of a 5-year-old who had had a completely satisfying day. Mary Covington Ford sat on the porch of the ranch that was half hers by law and entirely hers by the 12 years she had put into it, holding the hand of the man she loved. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach in 1882 with 2 bags and a rope and a folded letter and the smallest possible hope. And she thought that that woman deserved to know how it was going to go. She deserved to know about the roan heifer and the morning in the corral, and Dutch Calloway's suppressed smile, and Eduardo's wide, appreciative grin, and Cole Watkins learning to let the loop build properly, and Bernard Ford coming down those porch steps with his hat in his hands. She deserved to know about the fence line and the wildflowers on the kitchen table and the cornbread from his sister's recipe, and the railhead in May, and the full smile that was worth everything she had waded through to see it. She deserved to know about William and Clara and James Thomas, and the drought they had weathered and the ranch they had built, and the December evenings by the fire and the reading aloud, and the singing in the kitchen, and the thousands of mornings riding the range in the early light, with the Kansas sky enormous and blue above them. She deserved to know that the land was real and the work was real and the love was real, more real than anything she had imagined from a textile mill in Cincinnati, more real than any letter could have contained. The stars were properly out now, the whole wide Kansas sky full of them, and the fall air was cool and clean, and full of the smell of grass and cattle, and the particular richness of a ranch at the end of a good year. Another good year, Mary said, as she had said every year because it was always true. Another very good year, Bernard said, as he always said, because it was always true and because he liked agreeing with her on the things that mattered. They stayed on the porch a while longer in the good dark, and the stars moved in their slow, ancient courses overhead, and the Ford ranch was quiet and full and entirely itself, and the woman who had arrived with a rope and changed everything was exactly where she had always been meant to be.